Excellent. Okay. As we're short on time, I'm going to get straight to the meat and bones of the questions. Then, so fossil fuels and natural gas. Does anyone, or how do you see the role of natural gas in heat networks over the next 10 to 20 years? Is there a place for natural gas at all in heat networks over the next 10 to 20 years?
I'm sorry, after you. Do you want to go, Joel?
I think it definitely has a short-term role. I think transitioning to heat pump technology to do a step change to go 100% electrification of heat on heat networks overnight is not the right approach. I think there's a lot of risks associated with that in terms of both from the resident and the developer perspective, and just a general supply chain risk. And I think when you look at that relationship between peak demand and the utilization of thermal storage, I think in the short term there is a role for gas to provide that peak nature. However, I think that has to transition away over time as we get other solutions and we get more comfortable with heat pump technology. We start to connect heat networks up so that we can utilize multiple energy sources. So I'm not sure 20 years, but I definitely think there's a 5-year role, and then how much longer it lasts beyond that on new builds is to be seen.
I think that's pretty. I would agree with you on that. I just wanted to share a little bit of the experience I've had within from the HNDU, so it's the Heat Network Delivery Unit within BEIS. So we support typically local authorities to develop heat network projects up to the point that they're sort of investable. And what's been really interesting is that it's quite dependent on what the local requirements are, and also what the drivers of the individuals around there, rather than the sort of the technology side of it. But gas, if you're building a new piece of infrastructure, particularly if it's funded by a local authority with a decarbonisation target, so net zero target of 2030, they're going to really struggle to have gas within that mix. It just struggles to get through in terms of it doesn't fit within their plan. So there's a really interesting balancing act here between how you optimize your system to make best use of the resources, as we've seen, because it doesn't make sense to have a heat pump sized for that tiny bit of peak that you described. But there's a sort of political argument here as well. How do you get taxpayers' money to fund things if it doesn't actually meet the strategic objectives of that local area as well? So there's a balance here. And I think what will be really interesting is to see what alternatives can come about, where it might still be a fuel, but maybe or combustible fuel, but maybe a lower carbon option than natural gas.
One of the things I think we will have a slight struggle with is some of the institutional sales are American, German, European, and they're very comfortable in they could have thousands and thousands of units around the world, and they're very comfortable in that gas area, and so they're not going to move from that too quickly. So it's up to us to try and, I suppose, there's an education program. There's also a huge amount of data that we need to harvest and present to these clients. We have a client now, a German client, and they were surprised at the level that we had gone to on this building at the moment. So I suppose we need to have to push our clients, but yet we need to sell our buildings. So there's going to have to be a data fix here, and our industry will have to provide that to in the private sector.
Yes, Lina?
Yeah, I just think if we talk about, to bring up the legacy perspective, so for legacy sites, I think undoubtedly gas is going to keep having a role to play for lots of sites where we see that there's a lot of technical lifetime left on the current installations, and it, at least to me, makes no sense to take something down if it works properly before the technical lifetime would actually require it to. That said, there are many legacy sites that have significant improvements that can be made to them and start to make lots of preparations for decarbonisation, even whilst still being on a gas-based system. I also think it's really interesting on your point, Joel, with local authorities planning for a zero carbon target. I think in 10 years' time, at least my personal hope is that we start seeing some interconnectivity between different heat networks. And when you start connecting heat networks up, that does open a whole new range of opportunity for diversifying the production sources that serve the heat networks, and will enable for new types of production sources, such as waste heat, that can come in and take a portion of heat production.
I think that point on legacy systems and the role of gas is a really good one, because actually the role of gas can facilitate decarbonisation with heat pumps on legacy heat networks. Let's say you can't get those temperatures down, and you have to supply 65, 70 degrees for the space heating systems. You can still utilize a heat pump to preheat up to a sensible temperature, and then have gas boilers doing the rest. And so their role is retained, but it's actually in a way that's facilitating heat pumps and decarbonisation. So I think that's a really good point, and I think they will have a role in that sector for a longer lifetime than they will in the new build world.
Chris, what do you see coming through in the market? Do you see a lot of your solutions being tied with gas as well?
There's an interesting point that's not generally talked about, which is the integration of gas systems with heat pump systems can be problematic. I think the way that you run your heat networks as FairHeat eliminates a huge number of those problems. So I think it's technically very feasible to do. So I'm seeing the majority of what I'm doing as 100% systems, but increasingly I think that the rational arguments that were put forward by Mike earlier on, you can't argue with them. It makes a huge amount of sense. So I think it's horses for courses as ever, but certainly more modest size systems, 100% is by far the most common.
Okay, I suppose through the additional electrification of heat pumps, potentially in the short term anyway, as we move away from gas, costs of heat or the cost of heat for residents could be an issue. I mean, I wonder if anyone has any opinions on how this sort of journey to decarbonisation of heat will affect residents. And if that's one, I mean, maybe Laura, do you have, from a housing association perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I think it's definitely something we're really interested in, and I think where we are at the moment is trying to understand a bit better what that impact might be. I mean, just generally, we're looking at sort of where the regulation is going in terms of the market regulatory framework coming forward, and what that means around sort of publishing benchmarking prices and publishing prices. And as a result of that, we are also wanting to make sure that our prices are in line with the sector and affordable for our residents. So I think for us, we're sort of learning from the technical experts as well at the moment.
I think decarbonisation does often go hand in hand with okay, maybe increased cost or capital cost, increased cost to residents, but I think particularly with heat networks, they provide an opportunity to do something slightly different than just looking at it from a capital cost perspective. And what we will need to do to achieve the targets is to optimize that and maximize that. We need to create a low carbon economy. We need to use heat networks to attract private and public investment in low carbon solutions. And it doesn't have to just be increased cost. And increased capital cost is not necessarily an unassailable barrier. So something for me, we've worked on a solar thermal project where you've solar thermal with interseasonal heat storage serving a heat network. Yes, it's a high capital cost, high capital investment, but it gives you very, very low carbon heat, but it also gives you very, very low cost of heat. And so if you put that together as an investment package, an investment opportunity for someone looking for, relatively low risk, long-term investment, it puts a completely different slant on it. And you can tick all the boxes of it's financially attractive, it's low carbon, and it's not going to cost residents a fortune. So there are technical solutions out there that will decarbonize, that won't just increase cost to residents and increase cost to developers. And I guess as engineers, that's our role, to try and bring those through and pitch them away that will attract that investment.
I think there's to add to that. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, if we look at the energy white paper, there's huge sections on how to decarbonize, but with the focus on affordability and fairness. I mean, if you look at the moment at some of the schemes that are out, you've got the public sector decarbonisation help to really reduce the consumption requirements on buildings, even with some of the individual sort of dwelling solutions with the energy efficiencies grant, where people who are where you can get a sort of up to, I think it was £10,000, and to cover 100% of the costs if you met certain criteria in terms of I don't know, I can't remember the details of the criteria. If it, I don't think it was the same as being fuel poor, but I think it was based on household income, and then for those who were at a higher level were getting it was about 2/3, I think, of the costs would be covered. So there's a series, but I'll be quoted on that in case I got that one wrong. But there's a series of measures that have been put in place to reduce the overall cost, the overall amount of heat required, which then means that if the cost of heat goes up, it should hopefully not be as hard an impact. But I think there's something that we need to also bear in mind with all of this. And interestingly, with new schemes coming forward, we're no longer looking at the counterfactual being what the cost of heat from gas is, because you can't use gas as the heating solution for new builds. So there's already an understanding that the actual cost per kilowatt of heat delivered is going to be higher in the current context. But then there's a whole load of things you could do to lower that cost. You could look for dynamic pricing structures, have intelligent generation and storage mechanisms, and then hopefully we can also address the issue that's already been mentioned, that actually you can argue that gas is too cheap at the moment, and that the costs associated with with the damage that gas does to the environment are not fully taken into account. So there's a really complex issue with lots of things to balance up here, and if we avoid kind of taking this head on and saying, well, actually there are going to be some increased costs somewhere, somehow it needs to be dealt with, you end up with a much worse situation later on. Yeah, if you're talking about both carbon emissions, air quality, and just missing the opportunities to utilize some of these schemes to really lower the demand of these buildings.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I suppose, yeah, interesting on your point on the counterfactual, Joe, because really, I think if we look at the counterfactual, if we don't look at heat networks, it's individual air source heat pumps or heat pumps, which might not be relevant to a certain case, or it might be direct electric systems. So really, if we use heat networks and large scale heat pumps, we can actually bring those costs, operational costs, down. So that's also an important thing to note, and not getting too held up on the.
Okay, great, thank you. Related to that, so I'm going to move on to the questions. There is kind of quite a nice segue there, because one of the questions I think came in during the HNOO presentation, but I think it's not just a question about legacy systems, it's also moving forwards, is so many of the benefits identified were for end residents, not the housing associations, developers. How do you incentivize operators to invest when they don't get the benefit? I suppose that doesn't particularly mean just, if you flip it around to new builds as well, how do we incentivize housing association developers to develop a low carbon, low cost system? who'd like to take that one? Laura, are you on mute?
I was taking myself off mute. Yes, makes sense. To start with me, I mean, yes, I think if you're a housing association, I think obviously if there are resident benefits, then that's a good thing, because it's then very easy to link what you're doing to your corporate strategy, because your corporate strategy is all, you know, going to be around your resident offering. Probably what I would say is, you know, just really understand your costs, because when you do drill down into your costs and your income and expenditure account, I think, you know, there lies perhaps a business case. And going back to the sort of earlier point about, you know, tariff benchmarking possibly coming in, we might see some like sort of downward pressure on tariffs, and then therefore if you're having to subsidise your tariffs, there you've got, you know, a perfect business case to make improvements. You know, I think the other thing for us is what's been interesting is that we've been overlaying a lot of performance data with complaint data as well, and data on repairs and maintenance, and we do see a correlation between the two things. So we're trying to build a business case around, okay, we get these energy savings, which is great, we reduce heat network losses, but also they're potentially, you know, cost saving in terms of servicing and, you know, repairs and everything else. And I think in some places we're able to kind of start to clearly quantify that. So we're building a bigger picture, and that's where we are now. I mean, for us, it's not, you know, it's easy because we have a big portfolio, and therefore the costs that the, you know, our board will pay attention to. But that's where we are.
And I think from a new build perspective, I mean, Paul, you could maybe talk to a bit more in terms of how you think the value is perceived by end clients or end residents, but, you know, improvements, not just decarbonisation, but improvements to local air quality by not having as much or any combustion on site if we eventually move to all electric. And for those kind of sites, like there's a value to residents there, and there's a value to property owners and managers there.
Yeah,
very much so. And one of the,
oh,
sorry, Lauren. Sorry, and one of the things in the private sector we're looking at is actually not charging anybody for heat, because we think the buildings are so super insulated, they're very airtight. The energy efficiency of the development would be so much so that the energy meters and the energy consumption in the apartments would be on the low side. And we've taken it to such a level that we think that we will make it more attractive and just put the heat in the rent. And our investors are sharing that opinion with us at the moment. So that's how far advanced our billing has come. And, you know, years ago we were 200 euros a kilowatt hour per year per meter squared. We're 25 now. So, you know, the efficiency of the building coupled with the heating installation, we're putting our sales residential component out as an attractive proposition to people who have no heat bill. Now, obviously, these are pitched at a different market to the housing association, forgive me, but we're taking it to that level that there will be no charge.
That's really interesting. Sounds very interesting.
Very different.
I was just going to make the point. I think for us, just briefly, the environmental and social and governance agenda is becoming, you know, a really big thing sort of overnight, and primarily because investors, I mean, this is for housing associations, are showing a lot more interest around, you know, what organisations are doing, you know, there's a lot there's sort of growth in green bonds and things like that. So certainly in terms of like sort of the reputational issues, I think housing associations are wanting to demonstrate, you know, that they are leading by example around some of this agenda. So yeah, that's becoming more important.
One thing I would really like to see come forward, and I don't know if there's any complexities in being able to utilize a service like this within a housing association, or particularly sort of non-profit organizations within Heat Networks. I kind of alluded to them in my bit that some of them had challenges of how to pay back the investment, and I just wondered if you could incorporate both your energy billing and sort of servicing and the day-to-day maintenance of the plant into one kind of contract with an organization, so they then have a target to you have a set amount that you're willing to pay, and then they have the incentive on their side to try and reduce the costs, because they can then recuperate those costs. So then you kind of shift the responsibility away from the housing association to a private entity to manage the efficiency improvements, because then there's profitability in there. And then as they manage to lower the overall energy demand and cost of heat delivered, you could then have something in your contract that then trickles through to then lower your overall costs, which then lowers it to the end user. If the barrier is that you can't grab those savings and use them to pay back an investment.
You got a business idea there, John?
I could comment on that. Yes, yeah. That sounds very interesting. We are looking at sort of how we align our contracts with this program, and I mean, we've been talking to FairHeat quite a lot about this actually in different models. So it's not something that's been outside the realms of what we've been discussing. There's just lots of different approaches and sort of management arrangements actually on offer. So it's a good thing to think about.
Excellent, thank you. As will be aware, we've gone considerably over time. I think we can just fit in one more question. We just have 2 or 3 minutes, so really, the really quick one if possible. So how do you apply project by project to ensure client, design team, mechanical contractor and their own design and practical experience to drive the best results? So I think this is probably, which I think a few presentations alluded to, about organizational change, and it's a people problem and a process problem. I mean, what organizational changes do you think are required to deliver these low carbon systems?
From a private perspective, the commissioning of the building in the final, getting it ready to go over, is often the least looked after part of the development. So I can't stress enough, and FairHeat are helping us on this, the quality of the water, the quality of the install, setting the thing up. It's like having a racing car that you haven't tuned and you've just fired it into the race. So many developers create these buildings and pay so little attention to the final commissioning. So my takeaway from this is you've done all the hard work, you've done all the design, and then you fail at the last hurdle. So I can't impress enough about quality of water, all the things I described, and that should be the main staple, and the whole team should be working to that point, so that when you switch this thing on, it works so efficiently and you keep touching it. And so the maintenance of this is super important to us. So without both of those factors, all the other good work is wasted. So for me, that's the pinnacle of where everybody has to work to.
Yeah, I think to tie those stakeholders together from day one to final day that Paul's describing of handover is to basically have a performance specification from day one that sets out your objectives that you want to achieve from the system in terms of its efficiency, temperatures it operates at, the running costs, the performance characteristics that are important for the network owner operator, define them early on, and then have those consistently throughout your appointments of design consultant, contractor, commissioning engineer, and then you've got that ability to tie that through the whole piece, and then the final thing is proving that it's actually there and working in that way, as Paul's alluding to. But
yeah, and then I suppose like working onto handover, what I see a lot is O&M contractors don't really know both what they're trying to achieve from a system, or they don't have KPIs they're trying to achieve. So there might be something as simple as a return temperature, and a lot of O&M contractors don't know that a high return temperature means that the system probably isn't working well, and that's a very basic thing that they can look at, but there's just a very limited understanding from an O&M perspective of what they need to do.
So one of the things I noticed with this kind of challenge in my previous work before I joined BEIS is the ownership kind of side of the ownership of each of the pieces of work, where you kind of need both a carrot and a stick, where you need something that kind of, it's all well and good having appropriate handover, a good contract or what have you, but there needs to be something that both incentivizes people to do a really good job and to ask if they don't know how to check something, and also a way to kind of to penalise them if that job isn't done properly. And then you also need to have the resource to be able to check that, because you know, it's all well and good. You can have all the best contracts in the world if you don't have the right people to, one, do anything about the contracts, and then two, even check that they've been followed properly before it's been signed off. It doesn't really help you. So I think there's a big sort of challenge there around assigning responsibility and having mechanisms in place and the resource in place to actually enact it.
I think, yeah, absolutely. And I think you do need to add into that, you know, don't underestimate the value of developing long-term partnerships with stakeholders. You know, there is a lot of pride out there in the work that people do, design, construction, commissioning, and when you build those relationships over time, alongside having the contractual you know, measures, and to get people really proud of what they're doing, that can have a really big impact. And the best projects that we work on is actually when you have both those things in place, the right contractual setup, but also, you know, a set of stakeholders that really want to do a good job and get a lot of pride and satisfaction out of doing that.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so I think we've run over enough now that we have to kind of draw it to a close. Thank you, everyone, for attending, especially our 4 external guests,
Thanks, guys.
Paul, Chris and Joel. So thank you for attending. So I'm just going to pass over now to Gareth, who will just do a very short kind of closing out of the day. Thank you.
Thanks for that, team. Really appreciate that. I thought it was a really good session. I also just wanted to say thanks. Actually, after all, it is our birthday today, and I think the biggest birthday present we could get is actually, one, all the people who came and presented. So we had 29 people presenting today. 16 of those were external, and I really appreciated it for all of you to come. And also, I thought some discussion was excellent today. I thought it was really, really interesting. I also really appreciate everyone coming on and dialing in, attending online. Hopefully let's see next year what format we do this in, whether or not we're online again or whether we're back in a room with everyone together. I think a couple of things that were really interesting that came out for me today. Step change came out a lot, transformation came out a lot, and I think that came out across, we have to change as an industry how we are working. But I think the thing that I really liked about this last session that drew that together is we've got examples of where we are changing as an industry, we are actually delivering. And I think this is one of the things, you know, at the start of the day, I put up the sort of the scale of the challenge of what we had to achieve, and it could look quite daunting. But I think we're now seeing enough green shoots right across the industry that I think we can take the positives of that. I think we have to work on collaborating. It comes back to the point Mike put before. People have to, and also, you know, the point that others have been coming in, that James mentioned, people need to understand why they're doing what they're doing right across the industry. And also we need to find ways for people to feel good about what they're doing, because this isn't something that you're going to get a small group of people who are going to push this through, or any one organization. This has to be something we do right across the industry. So I think we're seeing transformation now. The one thing I would like to throw in, I think the checking the data, the assurance, actually putting in processes, sometimes it's really, really boring, but it's fundamental bedrock to actually making it all happen. And I think the technology's there. I think it's not rocket science. I think we need to just take it through the steps, make sure that we deliver well, and then I think we can get there. And there are just a few little tweaks that that we need to do on commercial models and regulatory frameworks, Joel, to make that all happen on the way. So I just want to say again, thanks to everyone. Thanks a lot for participating. All of the videos from today are going to be published, and the presentations will be up again as well. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Cheers.
And happy birthday, FairHeat.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.